MiniMax M3 is more than twice as cheap as GLM 5.2 on input tokens, 60 cents versus $1.40 per million, and if you're running a high-volume agent, that gap compounds fast. 3 times cheaper at the best community rates, and that's real money. Both models just dropped, and the use case split is real. I'm comparing GLM 5.2 versus MiniMax M3 across 5 tests to see who actually wins. But the coding benchmark tests flips the script in a way that might change which one you pick, so stick around for that. My name is Brian, and I'm in these tools 12 hours a day, so you don't have to be. Every number here is traced back to official model cards and benchmark leaderboards both companies actually publish. This one's for devs running coding agents at scale, where token costs and output limits hit your bottom line directly. Test 1, cost per million tokens. Take a solo dev literally hammering an agent loop across 100,000 tokens a day. That's 100 million tokens a month. At GLM 5.2's official input rate, you're paying $140. At MiniMax M3's rate, $60. That's $80 a month just on input, before output tokens even enter the picture. I looked at official list prices and the cheapest community provider rates. On input, MiniMax M3 is 60 cents per million tokens versus GLM 5.2 at $1.40. That's 2.3 times cheaper. On output, $2.40 versus $4.40. And if you go community rates, MiniMax M3 on OpenRouter hits 30 cents, while GLM 5.2's cheapest, Deep Infra, is still 95 cents. That's more than 3 times cheaper, right? MiniMax M3 takes cost, and it's not subtle. Every pricing tier goes its way. GLM 5.2 doesn't close the gap at community rates either. It's still 3 times more expensive at the cheapest providers. MiniMax M3 goes up 1-0 on the board. Test 2, coding benchmark performance. A 62.1 on SWE Bench Pro, that's the number that matters here. SWE Bench Pro uses real GitHub issues, not toy problems. So when a model scores higher, it's actually resolving the kind of bugs that cost engineering teams hours. The question is whether MiniMax M3 can match that, or whether GLM 5.2 earns its higher price tag on pure coding chops. I pulled the published benchmark data, and here's what's interesting. GLM 5.2 scores 62.1 on SWE Bench Pro, MiniMax M3 scores 59.0, a 3.1 point lead. GLM 5.2 also has Terminal Bench 2.1 at 81.0 and Frontier SWE at 74.4, where I couldn't find comparable MiniMax M3 figures. MiniMax M3 counters with a strong browse comp score of 83.5, which is really strong for web-based agent tasks, but that's a different skill set. GLM 5.2 wins coding. The SWE Bench Pro gap is real, 62.1 versus 59.0, and GLM 5.2 has the more complete benchmark suite to back it up. So MiniMax M3 just doesn't keep pace on pure coding chops, despite the price advantage. That ties the board at 1 apiece. Test 3, speed. A solo dev running an agent loop that calls the model 50 times per task. If your model is slow, that loop drags out, your feedback cycle breaks, and you're just sitting there watching a spinner. At 157.5 tokens per second median, GLM 5.2 has a published throughput number you can actually plan around. The question is whether MiniMax M3's architecture claims hold up to the same scrutiny. What surprised me here is how thin the data gets. GLM 5.2 has a measured median of 157.5 tokens per second from artificial analysis, and community reports put the fastest provider at over 280 tokens per second on base Satan. For MiniMax M3, I couldn't find a comparable published throughput figure. There are community-reported claims of a 9x prefill and 15x decode speedup from its MSA architecture, but those aren't measured against GLM 5.2 in the same setup. Speed is a wash, the testing setups just aren't comparable, so no winner here. GLM 5.2 has real numbers. MiniMax M3 has architectural claims that I can't verify head-to-head. Score stays 1-all, with one tied. Okay, So we've got a tied score and a cost gap that's already huge. But the next two tests, context and output limits, then deployment and modality, are the ones that could completely flip which model fits your actual workflow. If you're building anything that generates long documents or handles images and video, what comes next changes everything. Test 4, context and output limits. Both models claim a 1M token context window, so on the surface this looks like a tie. But max output is a different story. If your agent needs to generate a 200-page structured report or a full codebase in a single pass, hitting a hard output ceiling mid-generation means the whole run fails and you start over. That's where the gap between 128K and 512K output tokens stops being abstract. I looked at the published specs and both models hit 1M tokens on context. That's a genuine tie on long document reading. But on max output, MiniMax M3 goes up to 512K tokens, while GLM 5.2 caps at 128K. That's 4 times more output in a single call. GLM 5.2 does have a dedicated 1M variant for full window use, but the output ceiling is a hard limit either way. Now, to be fair, most coding agent tasks don't come close to 128K output tokens in a single call. If you're writing functions and fixing bugs, GLM 5.2's limit is probably fine. The 5112K advantage really only kicks in for specific long-form generation workflows. Think full documentation runs or large scaffolding jobs. So take this one with a grain of salt if your workload is typical agent coding. MiniMax M3 takes context and output limits because 512K output versus 128K is a 4x gap you can't paper over for long-form work. Both 1M context windows look like they'd make this a tie, but the output ceiling is the deciding factor. That puts MiniMax M3 up 2-1, with one tied. Test 5, deployment and modality. A product team shipping an agent that needs to parse screenshots, process video frames, and handle text. If your model is text only, you're duct taping a separate vision model into the pipeline, paying for 2 APIs, and managing 2 failure points. That's extra latency, extra cost, and extra complexity on every single call. Which of these two models actually handles that natively? What I found here is pretty clear. MiniMax M3 natively takes text, image, and video input. GLM 5.2 is text in, text out, full stop. Both models are open weight and self-hostable, so that's a tie on deployment flexibility. But on the modality side, GLM 5.2 just doesn't compete, and user sentiment consistently points to it as the stronger pure text-only coding agent with an MIT license that's about as permissive as it gets for commercial self-hosting. Now, if your workflow is purely text-based coding and agent orchestration, GLM 5.2's MIT license is actually a real win. It's the most permissive commercial license you can get on an open weight model. User sentiment is pretty consistent that it's the stronger pure text reasoning tool. So if multimodal doesn't apply to your use case, this dimension is kind of a wash for you specifically. MiniMax M3 wins deployment and modality because native multimodal support is a capability GLM 5.2 simply doesn't have. The MIT license makes it closer for text-only devs, but if you need image or video input at all, there's no workaround on GLM 5.2's side. That puts MiniMax M3 at 3-1 with one tied. Alright, so here's where GLM 5.2 clearly pulls ahead. It scores 62.1 on SWE Bench Pro versus MiniMax M3's 59.0, and it has a fuller published benchmark suite with Terminal Bench 2.1 at 81.0 and Frontier SWE at 74.4. It runs under an MIT license, which is as open as it gets for commercial self-hosting. And user sentiment consistently calls it the stronger pure text-only coding and agent orchestration model. And here's where MiniMax M3 clearly wins. It's 60 cents per million input tokens versus $1.40 for GLM 5.2, more than twice as cheap at official rates and 3 times cheaper at community rates. It natively handles text, image, and video input. It gives you 512K max output tokens, which is 4 times more than GLM 5.2's 128K cap. and it scores 83.5 on BrowseComp for web-based agent tasks. So here's the honest call. I went in thinking the coding gap would be the whole story, but MiniMax M3 wins 3-1. If you're building a pure text-only coding agent and benchmark scores are your priority, go GLM 5.2, it scores higher on SWE Bench Pro. But if you need multimodal input, longer outputs, or you're watching your token budget, MiniMax M3 is the smarter pick, 3 times cheaper. That's the number that closes this. If you want to see how these models stack up against a free local alternative, I ran that exact test in my video on Ollama versus Claude Code, can-free local keep up. It's a pretty interesting comparison if you're trying to figure out how much you actually need to spend on API access versus just running something on your own machine.